creation versus evolution. We're going to have an brief introduction, which I'm providing, a prayer, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers who are each going to talk for just 5 minutes on their specific interest on this topic. And then we got some questions that have already come in. And then as you hear the different interests in their talk, and if you have something specific, a question you have, please type that in through the messaging box. We're not going to be interacting from a sound standpoint with Zoom today. That might change later, we'll see, but at this point we're going to go with messaging. But I'm going to start first with a verse, and I bet you most of you could probably guess that verse, but Genesis 1:1. And Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. At the point that Moses wrote that, I think he would be pretty shocked as to where we are at today as a people on earth, how far we have strayed from what he felt probably was just a given, if you will, for those that are math students. But we have ventured, and we are a long ways away from that, and there are no ends in theories in how we came about and the things we see came about. With that, let's bow our heads in prayer. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this opportunity. We thank you for Sabbath. We thank you for truth. Lord, we're living in very interesting and unusual times, but we know that you're in control. We know that you created, that you will recreate again, and we look forward to that day. Until that day comes, Lord, we just humbly ask that you watch over us, our family, we lift up our prayer requests, and that our faith stays strong in you. Amen.
Amen.
All right, we have our 3 panelists, for lack of a better word. We have Jordan Reichert, who is kind of coming here from bringing it from a biblical, well, he'll talk about that. Art Miller, who's a science teacher here at Indiana Academy, and Peter Cousins.
Hello.
Who also, science background.
Science, math.
All have different interests, and so we're just going to open up 5-10 minutes. Anyone would like to volunteer first is what you would like to share specifically on the topic, your angle?
So I can start. I can tell you that for me, I had gone to Adventist schools till I graduated from Indiana Academy and did some public school, but in the high school, sophomore, junior, senior was at Indiana Academy. Then I spent 4 years canvassing. And then when I went back to school, I went to the University of Michigan and studied science and math there. And I was not prepared for what I ran into, because what I ran into were not professors who kind of thought this might be right. I ran into professors who said, this is the way, walking in it. And I was just a dumb Bible-thumping little boy from a farmland of Indiana who didn't really understand science and didn't understand what I was talking about. And it was a real crisis in my life, I've got to say. It was really a point where there was a time when I almost gave up my faith because of some of the things that I was hearing from my secular professors. And it really caused me to dig deeper into this whole issue and to find resources and different ways to understand science and faith and how those go together. In fact, I even talked to some Adventist teachers at that time, and they told me to keep my science over here and keep my faith over here. Well, that didn't settle with me. That was not an option in my mind. Science and my understanding of the Bible had to go together. So my quest to understand those happened when I was going through school there at University of Michigan. That's kind of where I came into this, my background on that.
Okay.
It's interesting you say that, because that was different than my experience. I grew up in the church, same thing as you, but I didn't run into that necessarily because I went to Andrews. There were times at Andrews when I came across some things that did question my faith, and I had to dig deeper. But as I dug, the more I dug into it through the Word of God and through listening to other professors at Andrews that had good, solid background in it, the more I realized, this is the way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think where I'm at right now is seeing some of my students go through what you went through
mm-hmm.
has made me more passionate. You know what? I want to share what I know with my students to help them to have a foundation to meet what's out there. And so when I took my master's, I ran into some, some evolutionists, and I didn't get into any deep, hard, Bible thumping debates with them, but it helped me understand a little bit where they're coming from better. And I spent some time in Wyoming, we can talk about that later, with Dr. Arthur Chadwick from Southwestern, and spent some time digging up dinosaur bones. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. That experience changed my perspective on it. And the summer of 2017, I spent a week or so with about 300 different people. It's a science symposium, if you will, or science conference with people from around the world. And just unbelievable some of the things they're finding out. And it really bolstered my faith again. But so that's my background, and I'm passionate to share with people. We have solid reasons for believing in creation.
Okay. Jordan.
Well, I'm on this panel for two reasons. One, I guess I'm Jeff's friend. And the other reason is I was working.
That's a good reason.
Yeah, I was working in my garden yesterday and I found a fossil. That's why I'm here. My angle is totally different in this. I was actually Peter Cousins over here, who I've never ever referred to as Peter Cousins, because to me he was Mr. Cousins. Was actually my biology teacher in high school.
A few moons ago.
Yeah, and I teach history and Bible here at Indiana Academy with colleagues with Art Miller. And my angle has increasingly over the last few years, what I have noticed among a lot of people in an increasingly secular society, especially teenagers, is kind of this appeal that people have to want to feel smart and not feel sheltered. And I feel like there's this stigma of a conflict between faith and science. And having a history background, I've really kind of semi-organically grown in a desire to study out the history of how people have thought about faith and religion with respect to one another in an increasingly post-industrial modern society. So I just finished my master's in church history recently, and I'm actually pursuing a further master's, a postgraduate degree, actually uniquely focusing on the history of the secularization of American society. So kind of the perspective I'm kind of bringing, I guess, is a theological one and kind of crosshairs with a philosophical, historical one, looking at the rise of secularism kind of hand and foot with the rise of science as a worldview. So that's kind of my angle. And my passion in it is that I want people to realize the truth about Jesus.
All right.
And don't take the punch.
All right. Well, we got questions, which is good because no one yet has typed us in a question. So if you have any questions, I heard dinosaurs. I mean, some people certainly have to have some questions about dinosaurs and the origin of dinosaurs, secularism, and Pete is potpourri. You throw him anything and he's ready for it. Potpourri Pete. But we do have some questions that we got earlier. Grant, go ahead. What's our first question?
Well, the first question is, why is this important? I think I think most of the people on here already, because they have joined, are in agreement that it is an important topic. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be wasting their time. But why is it an important topic? Because I think that there's definitely some people that would argue that within the church and outside the church, that's not even a big deal where we came from, and we can just walk by faith.
I'd like to jump in on that one. I'm sure they're going to have some feedback on that or something to say as well. I think this is extremely important because, let me just share, there's a book by Leonard Brand and Richard Davidson. And I'll just read it to you. It says, in the fourth commandment, God claims in 6 days he created the heavens and the earth, the seas and all that is in them. This is the important part. God claims that he wrote with his finger in stone. The Bible claims that God wrote with his finger in stone. If what God wrote with his own hand is false, why would the rest of the Bible be of any further interest? So it's important for a couple of reasons. One, is the Bible trustworthy? Is it true? And the second thing, the character of God overall. And I think it's particularly important right now because in the day that we live right now, we have hardcore evolutionists, hardcore creationists, and we have people that are in between, theistic evolution. And if you look at everything else but creation, the theistic evolution, and so forth, think about this for just a minute. Theistic evolution says that, well, there's various forms. One is that God started it and left it run on its own course. Other people say, well, God started it and helped it along. Every 1,000 years, something was designed. The next thing. Think about this for a minute. If that's true, and evil exists, there's a couple of things. Either God isn't good, he isn't all powerful, or he isn't all knowing. He didn't foresee all this death and suffering and sin and so forth. So it's important because is the Bible true? Is what it says about God true? And is his character like it claims that he is? He is all knowing. He is all loving. He does know the future. So I think it's important for at least those reasons.
Okay. For our audience members, you're going to hear a background noise. I'm going to close a door that's electronic just to eliminate the refrigerator noise back here and make it quieter.
And so I just want to add to what Art said. I affirm everything that Art said. When we read the verse in the Sabbath school today, John 3:12, and that ties into what Art was saying. Jesus said, that's really loud. Jesus said, if I speak to you of earthly things and you don't believe these, why would you believe the heavenly things or the spiritual things? And that's what Art was saying, that if Satan can chip away at our faith in the Bible and cause us to think that when the Bible, it touches on earthly things, when it touches on biology in Genesis 1, when it touches on astronomy in Genesis 1 and throughout the Bible, when it touches on these earthly things, when it touches on humanity, when it touches on anthropology in Genesis 10, when it touches on those things, if it's incorrect in those areas, why would you trust it in the spiritual areas? And the other thing I want to add to what you said is touch on the power of God. So for theistic evolutionists, if it took God millions of years to create, how long does it take God to recreate? And so when he says, I will give you a new heart, I will write my law in your heart, how long does that take? Does that take millions of years, like for some the first creation took? Or does that happen the moment I exercise faith in the power of God? So it really, it's like Satan is shooting missiles at the roots or the foundation of our faith. And if we give up those areas and we just say, well, just let science have those areas, then our foundation, which Genesis is part of the foundation of the Bible, and if Genesis is not right, then the whole Bible falls apart.
Exactly. And if you can't, I'm trying to build on these really good points here. If you can't trust the Genesis account, then why can you trust that Jesus ever came? Why can you trust that he rose from the dead? Why can you trust when he says he's coming back again? Why can you trust that there is a God? And I think in another sense, the reason I think for a lot of people that they would say, well, why is it really that big a deal? Like on a practical level, I think most people kind of just look at the here and now and what immediately affects them. And we're not necessarily, previous generations with more classical education would often sometimes think ideas all the way out to their full implications. But I think nowadays in such an immediate society, we kind of look at just, well, I don't think they're not that.
Right.
And take two people or take two objects that are moving next to each other. And if one splits in just the tiniest angle, they might be next to each other for a while, but you keep on following that trajectory, and before you know it, you are worlds apart.
That's right.
And I think that's the subtlety that you talked about eroding at the foundation. That's the erosion might be my only biological reference.
It was a good one though.
Very excited about that. That would be like that's eroding away at the foundation. And I think what you see is interesting that if you look, say, at the late 1800s, early 1900s, Darwinian evolution, Darwinian origins were still a relatively new thing with Herbert Spencer and then with Charles Darwin. And they were just starting to become popular in the broader context of America's academic life and throughout the world. And most people didn't see the threat or the full implications of those. They were still at the point where they were still here. In fact, by the time that World War I hits, most of society believes that humanity is evolving, is becoming so good that they think we're coming into like a century where a lot of people thought we were going to experience worldwide peace and they're never going to be fighting again. And they were shocked, like they were absolutely shocked at what happened with the World War, and 10, 15, 20 million people died. So I think the idea of the implication of what does this ultimately lead to is huge for why it matters.
Okay. Okay. How are we doing for sound? Give me a thumbs up if you're able to hear the speakers. Okay, I'm getting mostly good sound thumbs up. Good. Grant, go ahead with the next question.
I wonder if anybody on the
Yeah.
has a question.
Well, we're gonna.
Oh, they're texting.
They're texting. If you have a question, in the bottom of your screen, do messaging and send your question to us, and we will be monitoring that and ask that. Until then, go ahead, Grant.
So I think that we established why it's important. For anyone on there that doesn't exactly know what the biblical view is or the church's view, does someone want to outline that? Most people, and then maybe an outline for the evolution view and the two views, just to give a raw outline. Brief.
I think we read it at the very beginning, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, what we think the church's view should be, by the way, not everybody in the church holds the view, unfortunately, is that God created the earth in 6 literal days and rested on the 7th day. And that those days are literal, they're not great expanses of time, there's no gaps between the days. God didn't use evolution to create, he spoke and it was, he commanded and it stood fast. The evolutionary view is an evolving view. And so, a traditional view was that a long time ago, initially it wasn't quite as long as it is now. Now we're at 6 billion or 7 billion years ago. They keep adding more time so that they have more of a chance for them to be right. But that there was some cosmic explosion, all the material in the world fit on this in a primordial atom the size of, could fit on a pin, the head of a pin, and that exploded for some reason, and out of that there was all kinds of gooey messes everywhere, and somehow that got together, formed planets, and then in the swamps lightning hit and we crawled out of the swamp so many millions years ago, and it's the goo to you idea. I've oversimplified that, but that's basically their ideas. Now there's a lot of controversy right now of punctuated evolution, where there are these times of extreme, the pace of evolution increased rapidly at times, and so there's a lot of different views on evolution right now, but that's been the traditional understanding of how evolution happens. So evolution actually dealing with animals evolving into something better, that we're always evolving into a better existence, is some of that. And then with that too, the heart of evolution is this idea that strikes directly against the heart of the Bible, which is the survival of the fittest. And that goes directly against a message of love, if you think about it. I'm going to do whatever I can do to survive. I don't care about you. If I have to do whatever I have to do to you so I get up, one on you, and I survive, that's what I'm going to do. And the Bible teaches a different message of love and compassion.
So you already kind of got into it here, but another question that we have is, why does the SDA Church believe in a young earth? I think that there are a lot of people that, whether just in the Christian world, that Mr. Miller already mentioned, that believe that God created the earth and maybe helped it along, or just set events in place and just kind of went hands off with it. What is so vital, and why does the SDA Church believe in a young earth, and what evidence is there for that?
I'd like to answer part of that. Why does the church believe in a young earth? There's, we could go on for quite a bit of time about a number of different topics. Origin of life, how did it begin? Complexity, design. But I want to talk to you about something that's I have found of great interest. One is the lack of evidence of time in the geologic column, in the geologic record. And where does this come from? Well, a number of geologists, Adventist geologists and other geologists have looked at the layers of sediment. Okay, so think about it for a minute. When you go to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you put a piece of bread on the counter, you stick the next one on top. Well, if you're creative like some of my kids are and so forth, you stick another layer, and then maybe another layer. What's the oldest layer? It's the layer on the bottom, right? You put these layers of bread and you keep going up. Well, that's how the layers were laid down. That's how it works today when it comes to water. The first layer is laid down, and then the next layer is laid down, and so forth. What we find in the geologic column is these layers. We have a story. What's interesting is that in this story, in history, if you go look at these layers, there are gaps. There are gaps of time that are missing. One of these is in the Grand Canyon. There's like 3 different layers that are missing, representing 130 million years of time by the traditional view. Where did that time go? And then when you look at the layers themselves, if it's really true that it took that much time for these layers to be laid down, you would think there'd be some kind of erosion there. Think about it on the beach. You have a layer of sand from a storm or something coming up on the beach, and it's laid down. All you have to have is some footprints, or somebody come along and mess up that layer, and it's eroded very quickly, destroyed. Okay, let's take that a little further. What do you actually see in the layers of the Grand Canyon and around the world? They're flat. There's not much erosion there. Why not? Well, the evidence is that there wasn't that many millions of years. There wasn't a million years. It was laid down very rapidly. What does that point to? Short time. Another example in that same line is this, and it's called bioturbation. Dr. Arthur Chadwick spent quite a bit of time researching this. This has been published, actually. Some of these things that I've been talking about. Bioturbation is when these organisms burrow in the dirt. Okay, so you have a layer laid down, a layer of dirt from a storm or whatever laid down. And if you let it go, what do you have? All these worms, you have all these creatures, they burrow in the dirt, they make holes, they churn it up. And pretty soon, if you give it enough time, you're not going to see layers. They're going to be gone because all these organisms are churning it up. What do we see in the record? You actually see layers. Why? Because there wasn't any time. There's no animals there. They didn't have time to burrow in the dirt, which is a very good indicator of short time. So what are some scientific things that give evidence of a young Earth? That's one of them, the lack of time in the geologic column, and this idea of bioturbation. The research that they've done shows very little bioturbation, very little disturbing of the layers. And so that's one example.
That's deep.
So if I add to that, you know, the Mount St. Helens when it erupted, so there's actually a formation, they call it the Little Grand Canyon, that formed within, I think it's 3 months. And it has a lot of the formations of the Grand Canyon. It did not take millions of years to form. When that volcano erupted and they had Spirit Lake, that's right in front of it, there was a tsunami effect, if you will. And as the water came up and pushed, and it formed these little Grand Canyons that are miniature Grand Canyons that formed in a matter of 3 months with layering and everything, just like the Grand Canyon. It's phenomenal to see. I want to add to that and then hand this off to Jordan in a second here, because I don't know how much you know about Charles Lyell. You read any of his stuff? And
That sounds familiar.
so Charles Lyell was a geologist, and he at the end of the 17th century, right before Darwin, his stated mission was to get Moses out of science. And he wrote a book called Uniformitarian. It had principles of geology, but it had this principle of the uniformitarian principle. And what that says is that all things that we see in nature continue the same today as they have all through time. So in other words, when I look at the Grand Canyon and I see that there's a river that's been cut there, I assume I can measure, say, okay, well, a millimeter of rock is eroded every year. So the uniformitarian principle says, well, 5 feet have been cut away, let's say. How many years did it take that at that same rate? Because all things continue as they were from the beginning. So interestingly enough, Peter prophesied that that is what would be said. So if you have your Bibles and you turn to 2 Peter chapter 3, 2 Peter chapter 3, it's amazing that Peter, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, prophesied uniformitarian principle in the last days. And I'm going to start reading with verse 2 of 2 Peter chapter 3. That you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us, the apostles of our Lord and Savior, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? This is verse 4. For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. That's the uniformitarian principle. Prophesied right there that people would be saying that. Verse 5, for this they willfully forget that the word of God, the heavens of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that existed perished, being flooded with water. So in verse 5 and 6, what are they scoffing about in the last days? What are they using the uniformitarian principle to contradict in the last days? The creation of the earth and the flood. And that's exactly what we see happening in the secular world. They scoff. They are walking after their own lust. Incidentally, one interesting point, if you want to trace where atheism came from, go back to the Greeks. And there's a gentleman, his name just escaped me. Anyways, his philosophy was that he didn't want to have pain. And what he meant by pain was conscience and morality. You want to feel bad about anything. So, and the gods don't answer your prayers anyway, so why do you pray to them? And so he took that little step away from religion. Now it was pagan religions, but he took that little step away, and it gradually, like you said, a little bit off, it led into, it's the foundation of atheism. And interestingly enough, Alexandria in Egypt had a school there and a lot of science there. It came in the south, which we studied, and I won't get into that. But anyways, so that it's interesting where that philosophy began, and you see that beginning Epicureanism. That's it. The guy's name was Epicurus, and he's the one who taught that we had to get rid of pain. That was his philosophy that turned into atheism because they want to walk after their own lusts. They do not want to have a right or wrong. And that, I think, begins them down that path of looking for a way to explain the world without God.
Good. Jordan, you beat me to you beat me to second. No, you beat me to 2 Peter 3. That's awesome that you went there. Yeah. So Epicureanism kind of at odds with, I think, Stoicism.
Yes.
So the Stoics would say, oh well, you can't control life; it's out of your hands, and the gods are capricious. So just be cool and chill about it. But Epicurus said, well, do whatever you want, because this is all you got.
Forget the gods.
This life is what you got, so do what you want. Yeah. Kind of the old adage of eat and drink for as long as you die. A point that I wanted to make here that I think is interesting from a philosophical or from a historical standpoint on the age of the earth is if you were to right now grab any general world civ, like an ancient world civilizations textbook, whether it be at the collegiate level, whether it be the high school level. It doesn't need to be by a Christian producer. Go to your Preston Apprentice Hall or McGraw-Hill or whatever it is. If you were to look at the very beginning of what you find in that World Society book, you find that usually there's one chapter that talks about a Stone Age, some Neolithic age. But the thing is, even within that, they can't really give any. They never really are able to give fixed dates for specificity because we find city building, we find record keeping, we find complex structures and institutions all emerging around the same time, or a few thousand years ago. Why is it that? Why is it if there was, swathes of human population for eons and eons that we don't have any sort of record, like all of a sudden people just discovered, hey, I can write down symbols. Like, we have things like the pyramids. We have, you can go to, what's it called in Mexico? The Mayan pyramid there. I'm trying to remember. Chichen Itza. You can go to Chichen Itza And you can see how the Mayans designed a pyramid so that if you stand a certain distance from it and clap your hands, it makes the reverberations off the pyramid make it sound like an eagle. Like, you have incredibly smart human societies going back as far as we can measure. And why is it that all record of history, as historians talk about it, all emerges between about 4000 BC and about 3500 BC? Like, so you have a strong historical case for a young Earth in that sense.
Excellent. Great answers. I just learned a lot. We got some questions coming in. This is good. I'm going to go ahead and go with one of these questions. One of the first ones looks like from Ethan. Have they found any so-called transitional fossils? Well, we're going to look to provide some, as more questions are coming in now, we have a bunch of questions. We'll look to provide relatively short answers. So go ahead.
So two things. They found remains of supposed hominids or transitional that turned out to be hoaxes. The Piltdown Man and
Lucy, is it, or something?
Lucy is one that is really not a girl. Actually, they found out Lucy's actually a him because they've done more study. But Lucy is one where they found a bunch of bones in an area all spread out and pieces of it together, and they got the feet wrong, they got the hands wrong. When they Australopithecines, I think, is the actual whatever thing that they found there. And as they found other full skeletons of Lucy, because they never had a full skeleton when they found it in Africa, they found out that they got the hands wrong and they got the feet wrong. But having said that, I want to remind you of a statement in the Spirit of Prophecy that, I don't know if you've read this, I have it somewhere, I didn't think to get it up here, but the amalgamation of man and beast, Mrs. White talks about as one of the sins that caused the flood. And if you think about amalgamation means blending, the blending of man and beast. So first you got to digest how much technology that would take, because that doesn't just happen. But then once you get past that, you got to think about if they ever did find a half man, whatever, could it be that this was part of the amalgamation of man and beast? I don't know. At this point, I don't think that there's any legitimate creature that they have found that is a true transitional. And by the way, Darwin predicted that as we dug deeper into the fossil record, that there would be a plethora of these transitional fossils, not just of humans, but of horses and all of the species. And it's just not there. The fossil record has been widely studied now, and we do not find any missing links. They're still missing.
Can I just add something real quick on that? There's a couple of things you need to keep in mind when it comes to things like this transitional fossil idea. One, empirical science is what we're practicing today. We can see it, we can observe it, we can reproduce the experiment. Historical science is what they're doing with these fossils.
That's right.
Okay, we can do a certain amount of science on the fossils, but we cannot observe what took place in the past. And so there's a lot more guesswork there, a whole lot more guesswork. If our theory, if we have a particular theory and mindset,
Is faith, by the way, is faith a good word for that?
Yeah,
word?
yes,
Is
it is.
faith a good word? Okay.
and that word, not faith, but believe, the word believe is in a lot of the scientific literature. It is believed to be, and so forth. So yes, faith, absolutely. So the idea is we need to understand that when it comes to some of these transitional fossils, sometimes what's done is putting our own mindset on the fossil. This is going to be a transitional fossil. Now, if you just type in the internet, on your internet, transitional fossils, you get a list of fossils. This is what I want to talk about a little bit later. Maybe I'll say it now. It is too easy for us to jump to a conclusion very quickly. And if we don't take the time to really go into it deeply and research, we'll come to the wrong conclusions. And so it's important that we very carefully understand how science works and the two different types of science and our own biases, and that it takes time to get to answers. Maybe I better stop there.
Okay. Jordan, you had something to add to this?
I'm not much with the fossil record, but one thought. a guy digging in his garden could come across some skeletal remains of something. And I could take a look at it and sort of guess what I think it is because of what it might look like. But, you know, something that I think that's interesting to keep in mind is like, well, how many species of animals no longer exist that have gone extinct? So I can, you know, guesswork and say, well, that looks sort of like this, but man, it's kind of different than that. So you could come to two conclusions. Well, it is something different than that. Or you could come to the conclusion, well, it must be that and some sort of a variation or a version of it. And, you know, whichever is true, who knows? But the point is, it's not an empirical science. You know, Sir Francis Bacon would not be too happy with the way you're doing it. You're writing in kind of guesswork into something.
And I just want to add to that, very seldom, I mean, it happens, but very seldom do they find a full skeleton. That's an anomaly. That's not the norm. It's not normal to find a full skeleton of whatever preserved perfectly waiting for you to come to see. They just don't find it. So a lot of it is mix and match, and then imagination and desire of what they want to find as they try to redraw. All they know is that the animal lived and died. They don't know how it lived. Was it social? Was it isolated? They don't know what it really ate. They can guess. We think it was carnivore. Maybe it was scavenger. Maybe it was herbivore. We really don't know. So there's a lot of guesswork that goes into even identifying and figuring out what it is that you're looking at sometimes.
Can I say something here? I think that it's important at this point that we need to recognize, as we're all creationists, when oftentimes when I use the they word, we can get into team thinking and it's us against them and that type of thing. And we do believe what we believe is right, and others do believe that what they believe is right. But I think that it's important to remember, you know how you lose your train of thoughts.
It gets worse. It gets worse.
Oh my goodness. No, and so it's important to remember here that when there are gaps or there is something that maybe somebody doesn't understand who's representing a different viewpoint than mine, we all by nature revert to filling in the pieces that we don't have with what we believe to be true. And so we do the same thing as creationists. There's things about the Bible that I don't understand. I might not understand until eternity to come. And we fill in because we all have a narrative. We all have something that lies underneath the evidence, which is our guiding light for how we interpret evidence that we come across. And so we have the same thing, just like an evolutionist would have.
Okay, good. We got a lot of good questions here. We're not going to go necessarily in order here. I'm going to go, Ethan, that was a good question. I'm going to go with one from BJ here. Can evolution defend human rights? Is human rights compatible with survival of the fittest? Jordan, you want to?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to
Adolf Hitler?
Yeah. Well, and this is a good point. This is a good place to start. In fact, so I keep thinking Mr. Cousins, Peter, okay. References Adolf Hitler, which a lot of people say, oh, come on, that's an extreme example. Well, yeah, what Hitler did was very extreme, but it followed and flowed. You know, Proverbs 4:23 says, guard your heart because from it flowed the issues of life. It flowed, what Hitler did flowed out of this ideology. Well, we all came into being through this, you know, this process of just natural evolution, and the ones that survived are the ones that beat off the others. And if you're going to continue to survive, you take care of your own, you guard the resources. And what was Hitler's real ideology? It was that there were certain people that were lesser forms who were holding back the most advanced races. And in order for the earth to experience the benefit of the best races of humanity flourishing, he believed you needed to eliminate the weak ones so they're not competing. Germany was in tons of debt after World War I. The Weimar Republic that had come into being in the wake of the Versailles Treaty was it was chaos. It was no good. The nation was bankrupt, and people viewed the Jews as people who were really taking advantage of the economic plight of society. And so, you know, you look at that situation, and if you don't have something like maybe like a governing principle that says, this person matters because they were made in the divine image of God, they just become another person, become another creature that you need to compete with. Hitler wasn't the first person to do this. We had the eugenics movement prior to him. Hitler had a cousin who was, during the scramble for Africa in the 1880s and 1890s, he had a cousin who was one of the pioneers in the eugenics field, who was experimenting with eugenics on African prisoners as Europeans were coming in and colonizing. And the whole idea was, well, these are the lower life forms of humanity. And if you take that idea through to its logical end conclusion, well, then as much as it sounds horrible to us, and I'm not at all insinuating that a person who doesn't believe in God and who's an atheist, I'm not saying, well, therefore they're horrible people. I think there's a lot of atheist people who live better Christian ethics than a lot of Christians do. But the ideology at the base of it gives no explanation whatsoever for why I should not. Grant, I like your phone. I'm going to hit you in the head and I'm going to take your phone. Like, if there's no higher power, saying that, hey, you were made in the divine image and are supposed to reflect the divine image and the goodness of God, and he has established a moral law. If that's not in place, then what we're left with is, well, do what's best for you. Now, the response that you immediately get is you're immediately going to get a response from humanists, from secular humanists who say, no, we need to be good to humanity, obviously, in order to flourish. Human society needs to be good to one another, and they'll say there's not any atheists really going around today saying you need to kill people. A lot of atheists are really nice people, and that's absolutely true. But the ideology, once again, doesn't give any reason whatsoever for any sort of a moral objectivity in the universe at all. And it comes down to I think, you think. Well, who's right? Well, we don't know. Here's the thought. I like to take my students through this ringer. We do a Christian apologetics unit in one of my Bible classes, and we actually use the Holocaust as a case study. And people often say, well, okay, well, if there's no God, and the reason you shouldn't do this is because obviously society can't thrive in that way if you just kill people and murder people. So right away I say, well, okay, but what if my version of society that I want to exist does? And they say, well, it won't work because obviously in a survival of the fittest mode, if you're going to be the jerk on planet Earth, then everyone's going to gang up on you. And at that point, then I usually say to my students, okay, so then you're telling me that Hitler wasn't wrong, he just wasn't successful. He got caught. What if he would have won? What if he would have taken over all of Europe? What if all democracies fell? What if he would have established a state where you had the hierarchy was based by race and nobody ever caught him? Nobody ever got to him. Anyway, sorry. I
Okay.
keep on going.
All right. Wow. Good question.
One quick comment.
Yep.
He based it on Darwin. Darwin predicted that. And so a lot of these guys took Darwin's statements and ran with it. There's some really good questions on here.
Yeah, I know. That's
Sorry.
no, that's good.
No, that's good.
Next question. Go ahead, Grant. You pick one.
Actually, Mr. Riker had mentioned I was on my phone because I was looking up what this one was.
It was not your question.
No, I'm kidding. But it had been a while since I'd taken freshman biology. But are there? This comes from Amy Jacobs, and she says, "Are there any recorded examples of speciation on the level of mammals as opposed to single-celled organisms?"
So Jordan, where are you going?
Like I said, I have a fossil.
So I think in order to explain speciation, that is a biology term, which is a man's term. The Bible doesn't talk about, you won't find the word species anywhere in the Bible. But in Genesis, what you do find is each after its own kind. So the Bible talks about different kinds of animals, and it says it as kind. So there's the cat kind. Well, within the cat kind, there's a lot of variety within that kind. But a cat never becomes a dog. A banana never becomes an apple. So there's variation within a kind, but we don't see the macro evolution where you get what we call speciation, where it becomes a whole new kind of a creature. And I say that because there are limits within adaptation. We're talking about how an animal kind can adapt. And so when I was going to college, I had a Toyota Celica, and it was a stick shift. And one day the starter went out, and being a college student, I didn't have $350 to fix the starter. But I got really good at starting that car by popping the clutch, both in reverse and forward. I could, in reverse, pop that clutch and get it started. So I could adapt but there was a limit to how much I could adapt. If the transmission fell out of my car, I was extinct, right? And so I think when we talk about animal kinds and variation within a kind, we have to know that there is variation within a kind. This is how Noah got all the animals on the ark. He didn't need all these different dogs. He needed 2 wolves. And then the dog kind could have variations, and we get all the dogs we see today. But there is variation within a kind, but there's a limit. God has set limits on that variation within a kind so that, like I said, a cat will never become a dog. A horse will never become a giraffe. All of those kind of things. So
Took the words right out of Jordan's mouth.
Yeah, very definitely. There is variation. And I think I'd like to answer that other question about the bacteria, if that's okay. One of the questions was, what are your thoughts on mutating bacteria, viruses, antibiotic resistance? Going back to this, there's macroevolution, microevolution. We observe microevolution today. There was an experiment done here not too long ago with 60,000 generations of bacteria. Guess what? At the end of that experiment, there were still bacteria.
that's right.
There was change, no question, and they documented it. And we know that in our hospitals today, antibiotic resistance is taking place. Why? Because there's change. But like Peter said, that change is limited, and it's documented. We do not see kinds changing. Dogs don't become cats and so forth. And that's maybe oversimplifying it, but there is a limit, a definite limit to change. So I personally have no problems with what we're seeing today. You know, there's definitely a change in these bacteria becoming antibiotic resistant, but that does not at all give evidence for macroevolution. It just doesn't. God, as I see it, God put this into the genome in order for them to adapt and change. So yes, organisms do change.
And I like that point you just made, because if God being all-knowing, you would want your creatures to have a certain amount of adaptability. You wouldn't, especially after sin, you wouldn't want to have them have a very narrow range of being able to adapt to the changes in environment and whatnot. So.
Okay, good question. Grant, do you have more? Looks like Ingrid, and we don't. This is a big question. I don't think we want to dwell here for long. But she asked the question: are there different evolution theories? And the answer is yes, absolutely to that. Do you want to talk on that just real briefly?
I'll let Art, if he wants to.
I can't give you the names of all the theories and so forth, but I do know that in the scientific community today, there are definitely, there's a change, and the Darwinian evolution is under attack, but they're still committed to evolution. And so this idea of punctuated equilibrium, there's different ideas out there, but they are recognizing that Darwinian evolution has got some serious flaws. And the more we learn, the more it becomes, it's got more of a shaky foundation.
Yeah.
I can say that much.
Okay. We just got one that just came in here. Isn't the adaptation of species an evidence of creative genius? The ability for an organism to adapt to its surroundings in order to survive. I think that's what you said to it. So
I want to add one more thing
Go ahead.
about some of these adaptations too, and then you think about mutations, and what we find is mutations are usually harmful mutations, or no new information is added in a mutation. Things are rearranged or deleted, but no new information is added. So one example is there was a fish in Japan, I can't remember the name of it, it had eyes as it was up on the top, and then there was a separation. Some started dwelling in the caves, in the dark caves, and they lost their eyes. And so, you know, they said, oh, evidence of evolution, but what really happened is there was no gain of new information, it was actually a loss of information. And some people will point to the mutation in Africa for what is it, malaria, the sickle cell anemia. Actually, if you get sickle cell anemia, you're actually more resistant to malaria. And some people point to that as evidence of evolution, that they're evolving to something better. But anybody that has sickle cell anemia will tell you that that is not an advancement. And so even though it does make them more resistant to malaria, it's not an improvement in the human race. The lifespan is less. They have times in their lives where they're under a lot of pain. So analogy somebody said that really made sense is that with that thinking that is this mutation a good thing or not? It's like saying that I can get rid of athlete's foot if I just cut my feet off. I'll never get athlete's foot. That's a mutation. I can make myself, but is that really a beneficial mutation? Does that really add anything to me? No, I actually took something away from me, and now I've got to hobble around. And a lot of the so-called evidences in mutation are actually where information is lost or rearranged and it becomes more harmful than good, but it does help them survive in that particular situation.
Very good. But I see a number of kids in the audience. If you got some questions, go ahead and type them in your computer. I'm sure our panelists will love to answer them. I'm gonna go ahead and ask a question that came in earlier from someone who was young. It says, well, what about them dinosaurs? How does creationist fit dinosaurs into a young Earth?
I'd like to
Go ahead.
I'd like to jump in on that one. This is an interesting one. And I spent some time in Wyoming, and I just want to share a little bit about what I learned while I was there. They've been doing a research project, I think, since the middle 90s. And over this amount of time, they have dug up over 20,000 bones. And they take these bones, I had a chance to do it for 2 summers. They take these bones and they have a GPS system, very high tech, connected to the satellite. And when you first dig up the bone, you have to use glue and so forth. Make a long story short, we document down to the centimeter where this bone is, how long it is, its shape. We take a picture of it, they put it into the system. That's very good science. And they're at the top of their field right now. This is a little university. We know it, it's an Adventist university, but it's a little known university down in Texas. They go up to Wyoming every summer, they do this. What they have found is this. These bones were buried rapidly. And they're in good shape, they're pristine shape. And so it's not like they were buried over time, they were buried very rapidly. And they found these marine teeth, which indicates what? Water. And so their conclusion at this point is that these things were buried in a catastrophe. Well, what kind of a catastrophe would that be? This gives evidence of what? They were buried in a marine setting, they were buried rapidly, they're disarticulated, pulled apart. So it was a catastrophe of some type. It was buried rapidly, and it gives credibility to the flood model. I'm just going to do this fairly rapidly because of the time, but as Adventists, what's our understanding of how the dinosaurs fit into the young Earth? These catastrophes, just let me give you an example of 2 examples. Jack Horner, the guy behind Jurassic Park, okay, he did some digging. He found, actually ran into some Seventh-day Adventists at one point and found these duck-billed dinosaur bones. But what he found was an area that had 30 million fossil fragments, which he feels was up to about 10,000 dinosaurs. That was a catastrophe. And he points it out. This is amazing. Let me show you another one. This is even bigger. This one, I can blow it up here. I can't see it well enough. But basically, they found this area about 10 kilometers on a side. 10 kilometers.
Less than 10 miles.
Yeah, less than 10 miles. And what they found was they think 500,000 animals. 500,000 animals. And they're just blown away by this catastrophe. Okay, these are just 3 examples. The one in Wyoming that I went to, the 2 that they're saying, 3 examples of many more examples of these local catastrophes. When in reality, the evidence is pointing to a major worldwide catastrophe. These animals were rapidly buried, tremendous amounts of animals. To me, that is evidence of a young Earth and of a recent, of evidence of the flood that's explained in Genesis. Just amazing things that they have found. One other thing I want to mention, this is recent in the overall scheme of things. Mary Schweitzer is a scientist that works with Jack Horner, at least at one point. She found blood in dinosaur bones. There has been scientists since then. Okay, yes, yeah, there you go.
Right up there for you.
Yeah, since then, of not just blood, but collagen and soft tissue. Other scientists, okay, they're trying to, and I'm not going to knock them for doing this. They're trying to fit it into their worldview. Okay, I would fit it in my worldview if I'm honest. But to me, it's not consistent with millions of years. Okay, those kinds of things break down over time. How can soft tissue, how can blood, how can these kinds of things last 65 million years? That's the conventional view. So to me, it makes the most sense that it points towards a young Earth.
You do.
So that's my
Wouldn't be able to hear music and all them other things.
All right, someone went off mute accidentally.
Or
All right, George, you had something. Did you have something to say on that? You raised your hand?
Dinosaur?
No, I didn't think so. Okay, Pete?
No, that's why I had the slide ready, because I was gonna talk about the T-Rex, soft tissue.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, okay,
He
good,
nailed
good.
it, so.
You know, can I say one more thing, Jeff?
Absolutely.
Okay, Pete brought one thing out about amalgamation, and this is where I think that as Adventists, we have a privilege in a sense, our understanding of the great controversy in the scriptures, and then our understanding of Mrs. White's writings. She talks about amalgamation of man and beast. There's been some debate in the church at the very beginning of what that meant. I think it helps us understand. You look at a dinosaur. What is a dinosaur? Well, okay, we'll tell you what it's not. It's not a woolly mammoth. It's not these saber-toothed tigers. It's not a pterosaur, these flying reptiles. What is a dinosaur? Well, I could give you the technical definition, but a dinosaur is a mixture of, it has bird characteristics, mammal characteristics, and reptile characteristics. And you can see that. I don't believe in birds to dinosaurs, or dinosaurs to birds. I don't believe that. I think there's plenty of evidence against that. What I am trying to say is, it's pretty clear to me that a lot of these dinosaurs were not, in my opinion, created. Were some of them? I'm not going to say they weren't. But when you look at a T-Rex, those little arms on the T-Rex, what were they for? He couldn't reach his mouth with them. He couldn't support his body weight with them. Nobody else was there for.
Right. Throwing peace signs.
Yeah, throwing peace signs, yeah. So some of these things, the fact that it's got characteristics of birds, mammal, hollow bones. Now they're not like the bird bones; they're not structurally supported, but it does have some characteristics of birds, some mammals, some reptiles. Why? I think because very possibly, you think about it, if someone was alive for 1,000 years, and then they passed that information on to somebody else, was there kind of genetic engineering going on? Very, very possible. We're doing it today. We're doing it today. Why couldn't they have done it back then? So I think that there was some amalgamation going on with the dinosaurs.
Very good. Ethan has a question here. I think you partly answered it with regards to dinosaurs. We'll stay in the chapter on dinosaurs here for a few more minutes. When do you think that dinosaurs died and how?
Okay, well, maybe I should let you answer.
So I think a couple of things. I think there were some dinosaurs that were just man engineered, and then I think there were some dinosaurs that were maybe in the Garden of Eden, like the sauropods, where Job describes two creatures, Leviathan and what's the other one? Behemoth. And the description is like no animal we know except a sauropod on one of them, which is like a brontosaurus, brachiosaurus, those don't exist, but Diplodocus, those kind of four-legged, long-tailed, long-necked dinosaurs. So having said that, I think those creatures that were destroyed at the flood, there may have been some, very likely, I think there were some, that were these amalgamation, these that man engineered. Just like we engineer dogs now, that that dog can't go live in nature. If that little wiener dog that my sister-in-law had was thrown out and had to fend for itself in the wild, it would not last long. So we've engineered animals that way, just even within kinds. So it would not be, to me, it would not be a wild idea that man, when he was closer to creation, when he was a lot more intelligent, when he had photographic memory, when he had knowledge that we don't have, that they did things with the animals, just like we're starting to. You mentioned it. There's a thing called a transgenic organism, and it's where they mix the DNA, and so they'll take the DNA of a firefly. The tobacco company did this, and they put it into a tobacco plant, and the tobacco plant glows in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, they've done wild things beyond that. I mean, they're doing things with pigs, and so that you can have a transplant of an organ that grew in a pig. And there's just a million things they're doing with that. That field is now exploding, and there's so much going on. It's hard to keep up with. So there's no doubt that in my mind, that some of that was going on before the flood.
Okay, all right. Sarah has a question here. Can you say the name or give more information for further study regarding the group seeing issues with Darwinian evolution?
The what?
Darwinian evolution.
Groups? What do you mean? I got
Groups, yeah, I don't understand the question. What am I saying?
I'm not sure. I will say that at the end of this, we're going to be throwing up some resources, right? Art, you got a slide on that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of good resources out there. And Jordan also has a number of resources. So we'll be providing you with a list of resources in the event you want to continue to read. And I'm hoping that this talk, particularly with our young people, is spurring some interest to wanting to go out and read more about this topic. So go ahead.
Can I say one more thing about the answer about when the dinosaurs died? The conventional theory, again, keeps going back to the idea that a meteor or comet came to Earth and destroyed them. I think there's a lot of problems with that idea. But our theory as creationists, like Peter was talking about, our theory, or at least one of our, maybe I should say my theory, they died at the flood. A lot of them died at the flood. And there is going to be some question, even now, among creationists, as to where the layer in the geologic column is that the flood was. My personal feeling is that they all died at that point. Now, again, you've got dinosaurs that are chicken size. Okay, so maybe some of them weren't there. Maybe those were ones that were created. But what we don't find is after the generally recognized layer, after that layer, we don't find dinosaur bones. So that's a pretty good indication that dinosaurs died at the flood.
Okay. I'd like to ask our panelists, what are some of your favorite questions that you've gotten over time and you've gone out and researched those questions and come up with answers to those questions? So if you would, maybe just pick one of your favorite questions that you've gotten. You're all teachers, and we can all see that quite clearly. And I'm thinking, I'm seeing spiritual gifts here of a group of men who have been blessed, to teach. And just kind of dig back in the archives of some question you got at some point. Maybe it was when you were young as 10 and you know the answer now. Go ahead, Art has one.
Okay, I'll start. One of the questions that I've got is a question.
Okay.
So what do you do with something that you can't answer? And we're not honest if we don't say as creationists, there are questions we can't answer. So what do you do with that? Well, this is actually one of my favorite questions because we want answers and we want them now. I want to know now. I got my cell phone, I can look it up on the internet, and bam, I got my answer. Maybe it's wrong. So I think we have to consider something, and let me give you an example. When we come across something we can't answer, we need to take time to think it through very carefully and do research. Here's an example, and I've got a presentation on this. I'm gonna have to condense it to 3 minutes here. So here's what happened back in the 1970s, okay? In the Yellowstone Park, you know where Yellowstone Park is out west. There was evidence of fossil forests that took a long time to form, okay? And what they thought was it would take about 1,000 years for these forests to grow, and over time they would go up, and then a volcanic eruption would take place, wipe out these forests, and they'd be stuck there, okay? And then the next time, another 1,000 years, another group of trees would grow up and then wipe them out, another volcanic eruption, wipe them out. They found multiple layers like this, multiple layers. And so what they thought was, this clearly destroyed the Genesis account. 6,000 years, that's not possible. Okay, so we're just gonna, this blows your idea of creation and blows creation theory, especially the idea of 6,000 years. Because they found up to 100 layers. They thought this, or 100 times they thought this happened. 100 layers, 100 times. That's 100,000 years. So here we are as creationists saying, okay, well, how do we answer this? There are people today that are still have gone out of or away from the creationist theory or idea because of this very example. Here's what happened. Over the next 30 years or so, Seventh-day Adventist scientists, along with others, researched this topic for 30 years. What did they find? Here's what they found. They did analysis, I can't go into all this, but they did analysis of the soil, of the leaves, of the trees. One of them was upside down. That would spark, you'd say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Okay. What they found was, the evidence was that these things were not growing in place, even though they were upright. Their roots were off, their branches were off, the leaves didn't match. What they found was they were volcanic flows and water bringing the stuff in. They published their results, and as a result, National Geographic ran an article on it. The park took down the signs saying that this took this 100,000 years and whatever. Why? All because creationists said, there's a deeper answer here. There's something we don't know about this. We're going to dig deep and find the answer. And I think that as creationists, we have a unique viewpoint. We could say, well, what about this? What about this idea? When we come across a question, we shouldn't just throw in the towel or say, oh yeah, wow. Because there are going to be questions we can't answer. We should take that question and say, I'm going to see what I can find out on the answer. I'm going to dig deep. I'm going to keep after this.
Can I tag on to that?
Go ahead.
So the question was, what are some of your favorite questions that you've received, and what type of study did that spark and whatever? And kind of going off that idea, when you encounter something that you don't know, not just quitting on it, whatever, but like throwing yourself into studying it. I think what's interesting is from a theological standpoint, as Christians, it is okay to have the category of not knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the scripture communicates to me that, like, I am the creature, and there is the creator, and there is stuff that exists within the sphere of knowledge that I am not privy to. And there is the allowance and the permission for that to be okay. What I think is interesting is the philosophy of evolutionary science, which is, I will call it a philosophy because I believe it is one, does not, not to say that an evolutionist believes they know everything, but like the idea is that man is the highest intellect in the universe. Humanity is the highest intellect. So humanity has to reach the point of understanding that. And I think that idea in itself, I've had students ask me before, like, talking about just that theory of knowledge and how can we know or whatever. And I think that's interesting to have that discussion and say, you know what? It's interesting that I might not be able to know everything, but as a person who believes in the Bible, I have a category that permits that within my philosophy, whereas that category doesn't exist in an atheistic. And I think this kind of brings me into another major question that people have asked, like, oh, well, but the Bible, isn't that just a matter of faith, whereas science is reliable, it's concrete, and you can see it, and you can demonstrate it. And that intimidated me for a lot of years, because Pete knows that I'm no scientist, and that I wasn't like, you know, bringing home the prize goose with my great like science grades. So I've sometimes not been able to like speak to some of those types of issues, but understanding the philosophical underpinnings of it, kind of, so that question of, well, is it science based on, you know, measurable hard data? And it kind of prompted a lot of reading for me, and to the point where now I actually really enjoy talking about this to people, because there's a series of assumptions within an evolutionary viewpoint that, I'm not saying that creationism doesn't have assumptions. I have a lot of assumptions. I believe there is a God. I can't put that in a test tube, but I believe it to be so. But once again, my philosophical viewpoint allows for that to be so, because I'm not the highest being in the universe. Whereas you have a series of assumptions that can be categorized as faith. And so these are kind of transitioning from the question part from me right now into the things that I studied and found out. You mentioned earlier the principle of uniformitarianism, which is just interesting, because that very concept is trying to apply what you're currently measuring into a part of the past that you were not there to measure, right? Which you can't do. So you have to admit that what you're doing is you're projecting your present conclusion to something you don't know, and that's called faith. Or if we don't want to use the word faith, we can call it speculation, but we can't call it data, right? And so there's a lot of holes like that, and I think oftentimes the thing that I've come to discover is that there's a lot of faith assumptions. I had to do a whole presentation with my students where we talk about faith assumptions in an evolutionary worldview. But because there isn't necessarily a God associated with those assumptions, people don't necessarily want to call it faith. Right. Another major one is the idea of, you know, I don't even know if the jury's still out on the Big Bang or whatever. Is that still considered by a legitimate? But in the scientific community, is that still good? Okay, so I guess going back to the philosophical idea once again, you know, chemicals react and the chemicals are present to react, but we're trying to answer where matter came from. Yeah. We're trying to answer where the stuff that make, you know, why is there something instead of nothing? We're trying to answer where the scientific laws came from in the first place. If you don't have the laws and if you don't have the matter in the universe in place, then the laws can't react to create the explosion. And yet we're purporting that the inverse of that, which becomes not a matter of science, but a matter of philosophy and faith. Yeah, which becomes a matter. And I think those types of questions that, you know, well, isn't this based on, and this is based on this? And then it drove me to do a little more research on just the history of development of modern science since basically the scientific revolution. And what you find is, man, a huge majority of like scientists were huge creationists. You know, you talk about Isaac Newton, who's like, I have some time off, I'm gonna put a needle in my eye and discover the laws of optics. He actually did that. Weird. But like, you discover that this guy believed heavily in God. He wrote more about Bible prophecy than he ever wrote about science. You know, you look at any number of these really critical pillars of the development of modern science, and you found that they were looking into science as a way to discover more about the creator behind it. And so those are some of the questions from me.
And some of them quoted said that they were thinking Kepler's laws of motion for physics, said he was thinking God's thoughts after him. That's how he looked at science. Yeah. He was trying to figure this out. So there's a cartoon I used to use in class. It goes along with what Jordan was saying. I have to share this. So a little cartoon caption. The one first picture, there's a scientist in a lab, and he's got all of his materials there and his apparatuses and his equipment, and he puts his fist up and down. He goes, I'm going to create life. And in the next slide, from heaven, God speaks and says, okay, and everything goes black. God makes everything disappear. And then God says, in a screen of total blackness with nothing there, God says, now begin. Bring something out of nothing, because that's really what happened. Right. So even our weakest attempts at creating life is simply manipulating what God has already given us. We've not really created life at all. So questions that I've been asked is, some of them we've answered already. How did Noah get all those animals in the ark? That's one a lot of people ask. And there's so many, how did they all fit in the ark? And another one was, how do you find where are the billions of years at in the Bible? Those kind of questions. But some of those we've already kind of addressed here.
We didn't address how in the hell he got all the animals in the ark.
Because of the kinds.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the variation within the kinds. So God didn't need hundreds of different dogs. He just needed 2 wolves.
And the
those-
Chihuahuas were stowaways.
they were a ways away. and man, by breeding dogs and cats and other things, we've been able to make variation within that kind.
And the interesting thing is when we do that, we're losing information.
That's right.
Interesting. Well, we're gonna,
Oh, sorry, I want to weigh in with one more. Is that all right?
yeah,
Another question that I've gotten is, well, if faith in the Bible is just as believable, then why is it that science seems to be the most credible in our society? Why is it that science seems to be the preeminent, intelligent, and like man, this is like right out of my interest alley, and so I love it. The few times that I've had students ask questions like this, it's really interesting to me. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I will say this: there was a serious movement within the late 1800s to put science at the forefront of every single academic discipline, and not science. You know, you were talking about the difference between scientific method, Baconian, that type of thing, and other types, but like the modern science of more the evolution strand. And what's actually interesting is at the same time that humans are trying to apply science to every single era of life, post the Enlightenment, post the 1700s, you also have people are beginning to apply science to the workplace. I forget the guy's name, but he wrote a manual on how capitalist factory owners could get the most out of their workers through efficient means, and it became the model for how to run business. You have it applied to the concept of capitalism. And people started to apply the principles of science and scientific laws to society. And sociology in America becomes a huge field of study in the late 1800s. And it's what's really interesting that some of the earliest sociologists in America, guys like William Charles Sumner and I'm trying to remember the other guy, Lester Ward was probably a really big one. A lot of these guys occupied chair positions or presidential positions at some of the biggest universities in America. And they actually intentionally made it, and you can actually access some of the letters that some of these guys wrote back and forth to where you can actually find that they were intentionally communicating that it was an agenda of theirs within sociology to apply science to society and to bring it into higher education to the extent that it would eventually crowd out what they believed was dogmatic religion. And I was just reading, even just earlier today, some of the letter correspondence between some of these university professors, professors at Harvard, at Yale, at Cornell. In fact, one of the presidents of Cornell in the 1890s, a guy named, I keep forgetting his name.
all schools with their roots in religion.
Yeah, all schools, by the way, which started as some version of a seminary. Harvard in 1636 and Yale in 1701. They're all seminaries, right?
That's right.
But Andrew Dickman White, that was his name. So Dixon White was the president of Cornell, and he wrote kind of one of his most famous books ever, where he spent 20 years of research, and it was the title has something to do about the history between religion and science, the history of warfare and tension between religion and science. And it was actually an intentional plan by university professors to sort of try to push religion to the periphery. And you had several other things happening societally in America at the same time where Christianity was kind of taking on a bad name, whether either with some of the social gospel advancers, or you also had a fundamentalist movement at that point in time, which as Adventists were not necessarily quite to the extreme of the fundamentalists, who were sometimes so fiery in their rhetoric and everything that it almost just put a horrible taste in people's mouth from religion. And so society as a whole change kind of culturally over to the idea that science is the most preeminent, intelligent of all the disciplines and studies.
So I want to tie into that with Daniel 11, the king of the north and the king of the south.
Okay. And
the king of the north is Babylon. The king of the south is atheism. And that, at the time of the end is when that began, 1798, we're right in that time period. I mean, there was things going on before that, but 1798 is when the Pope received the deadly wound. And now the king of the south is pushing, but we know the king of the north is going to come back like a whirlwind. And we see that happening as the king of the north is ascending, as papacy is ascending, the deadly wound is being healed. It's going to be interesting to watch that secular hold that's on our culture right now, to watch that melt away as the king of the north comes to power.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But yeah.
All right. Well, we're gonna look to wrap up here in probably about 10 minutes. There is a good question that just came in. It gave me a chuckle when I read it. Aaron Clark. I'm not sure who that is, but we'll read his question.
Are you guys done with the fellowship hall?
If you would have cut down a full-grown tree if you would have cut a full-grown tree down on day 3 of creation, how many rings would it have?
Can
Go
I
ahead, Pete. Go
answer
ahead,
this
Pete.
question?
Go for it.
Pete.
This is a great question. I should have added this into my questions. I get asked a lot. That's really good.
Okay.
So God in creation, if you think about this, forget the tree for a minute, think about Adam. If you came up to Adam and you used all your science skill, you measured his teeth, you had a conversation with him, see that he could clearly speak and his comprehension was there and all those things were there, and he was mature like an adult, you would probably guess his age. Now, if you look for a belly button, you might not find one. Not sure if he had one of those, right? Because he was definitely, now maybe God poked the belly button in there, we don't know, but you would guess that Adam was 26, 30 years old. And your best science would tell you that, right? And you'd be wrong, because he'd only be a day old. So we believe that God created creation with age when he created things, including not just man, but trees. When he created the stars, I don't think God waited. You know, some of the stars are far enough away that it takes days and months and years for that light to get to the earth. I think that God just created that so we could see that stream of light when he created. He created things with age.
That's actually a question I've had before.
Yeah, and it is a very good question, because there are different, even within our church, there's different takes on that. There's a book out, and you'll see it when we do the resources. A book out.
You want to go ahead and put those up?
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna do that.
Did you send that to me?
I think I did.
Let me see. Go ahead.
I'll check.
Keep going. I'll check.
There's a book out by the seminary, the Adventist Seminary, that talks a little bit about, actually it's all about Genesis and creation. And it points out the differences between the views, but also that there's the structure of Genesis 1. I've done some study on this, and I think I agree with it. The structure of Genesis 1, if you look at verse 1, and the rest of the chapter all the way through 2 verse 4, I think it is. The structure of the passage seems to indicate that it's saying God created everything, then God created the earth, and then it goes back to how he created the universe. In other words, he created the universe, then he created earth, and then it talks about the conclusion, he created the universe. And when I first read that, I thought, this is interesting. I hadn't really quite come across that before. And that's not at all taking away from the fact that it happened in 6 days that God created earth, 6 literal 24-hour days. But what it does say is that it points out in Job, when the sons of God came to talk together into his throne room, that there are other worlds, and that God is not limited to our viewpoint of thinking he had to create it all at once. Maybe he did create the universe first, and then he came along and created Earth in that 6-day time period. And so if you want some study on that, it's fascinating. They've taken some pains or some deep study to look at the structure of Genesis chapter 1, goes all the way through verse 4, chapter 2, verse 7, I think it is. But it opens the idea up to, hey, you know what? Perhaps our viewpoint, we need to study the scriptures more carefully. And our idea that everything has to happen like we think isn't always the case.
So I didn't get the email.
Oh, okay.
But I did put a website up, Answers in Genesis website.
Okay,
That
Great.
should be shared.
great. Are you going to post this on your site?
I'll try.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Did we
just lose it?
I'm still on.
It's, okay.
I lost my connection.
So I'm sharing with everybody a website that has been very special for me. When I was going to University of Michigan and hit that wall on some of these questions, this website, Answers in Genesis, was a huge support for me because this is any of you have been down to the Noah's Ark and the Creation Museum real close here. These are the same people. And there's just a lot of PhDs and science specialties in certain areas, and there's good scientific information there if you're interested in that. And there's also a section for kids, and they've got some neat resources for kids also from the Answers in Genesis. So I'm going to stop sharing it. You can probably share your screen, Art.
I'm just wondering if I can.
Yeah, you should be able to. Let me just take a peek.
And just for other panels, we're going to close and just
Oh, yeah.
kind of your closing thoughts, 1 or 2 minutes of anything that you have. And Art's going to put up his resource list.
There we go.
So we're going to close by we'll let Pete, can you want to just share a closing kind of 1 or 2 minute thought? And then-
Yeah, going back to where we started, why this is so important. Satan is the father of lies. He is a master at lying, and he has filled our culture, and not just on science. There's so many different areas where this is true, but he has filled our world with lies, and this is one of those lies that has long-term ramifications and whatnot. So this is why this to me is so important to study and so important to be aware of, so that we can, with apologetics and other things, we can be wise and we can answer some of those questions.
Thank you. Art, you have just closing thought?
Yeah, I think the same thing. It's so important. We have evidence, solid evidence, for belief in the Bible. And you know what? I'm a creationist, not because of the scientific evidence. And I know that sounds funny, but let me finish my thought. I am a creationist because of the Word of God. I have come in my own experience back to the Bible again and again and said, you know what? Either this document is true or it's completely false. And I have come back to it is true, it is solid, it is reliable. My scientific study has reinforced that belief in the Bible because I see solid scientific evidence. So I'm a definite believer in the Word of God as the ultimate source for truth. And science complements that. It's not in disagreement. It's not in a separate realm. They work together. But what we need to do is when we come across a question, say, I'm going to study the Bible more to make sure I understand the scriptures properly. And I'm also going to study science more to make sure I understand science.
I would say that you guys have said most of all of it, but there's nothing new under the sun, and this issue is way older than Charles Darwin. And I think you look at the original lie of Satan. So here's the thing: at the end of the day, people are going to believe whatever they choose to believe, and there's usually something that matters to people more than evidence. To a lot of people. Ultimately, we have certain kind of assumptions about life in the world that we've already kind of made. But I think it's interesting that this is the same story repeating again and again. What did Lucifer want? Isaiah 14 tells us, and we're told in Ezekiel 28 and other places that he wanted a position that was God's. He wanted to be God. And then he fell because it doesn't work that way. Because society and human flourishing and the universe flourishing only works when God is God, because he's the only one who can do it. And then he comes to Eden, and what does he tempt Eve with? The idea that God is trying to keep you out of special knowledge that you could have and you don't need him, that you can in a sense be like him. And the whole history of the Bible is mankind trying to be the highest being in the universe. It just doesn't work. And I think whether or not you actually, whether or not this is meaningful to you, or whether wherever you are, whoever you are on this decision, it's worth at least noting that this book communicates a large narrative where humanity throughout history has tried to put itself in the place of God. Whether or not you actually believe in God, human society, human culture has. And throughout human history, we see humanity trying to be the top, trying to be the smartest, trying to be the best. And this is just a more civilized, maybe, not even, but maybe, version of that same old recycled story. It's just the same thing all over again, which to me lends credibility to the biblical account that there's somebody behind this who's trying to thwart our connection to the Creator.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists. If you've enjoyed it, maybe just clap by your screen there or your thumbs up and give praise to the Lord.
We're doing resources.
Yeah, we pulled them up.
Oh, I have one or two I just want to share.
Okay, real quick, Jordan has a couple of resources.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I'm not swanky and high tech. I brought books in. These two.
He's the youngest one here, what?
Yeah. Actually, I have three. First of all, The Secular Revolution by Christian Smith. He is a sociologist. He's the chair of sociology at the University of North Carolina. This whole book, the subtitle is Power, Interests, and Conflict in the Secularization of American Public Life, and it has to do with how society there was actually an intentional secularizing process, from journalism to higher education, to politics, to medicine, to all sorts of things. This one is kind of similar. This is by a historian who's at Notre Dame, The Soul of the American University, from Protestant establishment to established non-belief. More of the same. Really interesting stuff, the story of American higher education and how religion has or has not played a role and how science has ousted religion. And finally, this one's really interesting because it's written by David Berlinski. He's a Princeton physicist, and he's actually an agnostic, but he takes issue with atheism. He takes issue with extreme atheism that says faith doesn't have a place in the conversation and says that science is the only way to view reality. And this whole book is, one of the top scientific minds of the world taking issue with what you might call the gatekeeping of modern intelligence. So some cool resources. Thank you.
And this is a short one. This is a very simple book. You can read in an afternoon. Choose You This Day. You can get it in a lot of places probably, but the ABC is a good place. Choose You This Day by Leonard Brand and Richard Davidson. If you're really into it, they have another book out, Arthur Chadwick and Leonard Brand's, about 500 pages. It's really good.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Just a short testimony. We did not come together. We did not prep, nothing. Our prayers amongst all five of us was simply that the Holy Spirit would use us and to lead this conversation today. And I, for one, think that happened. I thoroughly enjoyed it and was blessed. It was recorded. I'm not sure where it'll be posted.
It's going to take me a week at least, because when I get back, I've got a constituency meeting and all that stuff I got to do. So, but I'll put it on that For Better Promises website, forbetterpromises.org.
Okay, then it's the number 4.
Number 4.
For Better. There's a lot of other resources on there. Check it out. The last commercial would be at 7 o'clock, hopeawakens.com. The meeting 2, if you haven't been watching it, I encourage you to join us then. And before then and now, I encourage you to get outside, get some fresh air. And a lot of us have been cooped in. But let me go ahead and close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for the knowledge that you've given us, Lord. We don't have all the answers that has been discussed here, Lord, but we know that you are the God and we can trust you, and we can certainly look back in our lives and see where your hand is at work in our lives. Lord, no doubt as we go in the future, there'll be questions asked of us for which we don't have answers. May we be patient, may we listen, and we know, Lord, that you will provide the answer in your time. I lift everyone up here, all of them in our audience, all our prayer requests. We're thankful for Sabbath. We're thankful for the opportunities that are presented to do things like this that probably wouldn't happen but for the circumstances we're in. But we pray for all the frontline workers at the hospitals. There's a lot of people on our mind. We're just going to continue to trust you, and we know how this turns out. You're coming home soon. You're going to come to this earth soon and take us home, and we look forward to that day. Lord, thank you for being our God. We pray this all in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
forbetterpromises.com.
Yeah. .org. .org.
Oh, .org.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Forbetterpromises.org.
Yeah, there you go.
For promises.
For better.
For better promises.org.
4, number 4, betterpromises.org. All lowercase, all one word. Under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
They
It's up there.
were asking that.